Hey everybody, welcome back. We are going to continue going through a few things today, and I'm going to get into your assignment near the end of the video. So if you screen this more than once, just fast forward to the end of the video and you'll catch everything that is due for next week. So I'm going to start in with the Illustrator arranging document in the arranging shapes folder we downloaded sometime between now and last week. So I'm going to open up the arranging shapes document. We'll open up this guy. Okay. And I have not necessarily set up my workspace in this particular application here at home. I just installed the latest 2020 version of Illustrator, and it reset all of my panels. So even though I do have a preset here, they're not necessarily correct. So if you see a different layout, you can try to set it up this way if you would like, just going into your window menu and selecting the various panels that you'd like. And what I want to talk about here first is this idea of arranging shapes. And it might be helpful if you open up your layers panel here and just observe what is happening to the various groups and paths that make up this graphic. Now, the first thing to take into account is the stacking order. So if you look at this closely in your layers panel here, you're going to notice that everything is kind of stacked in sequence, right? So the ones on the top are stacked on top of the ones underneath. And so that would be the case here as you look at this visually. So the center one here, when I select that object, it's obviously going to be at the bottom of the stack because of the overlapping effect that we have of these two surfboards on top of this one. Alternatively, I could select any of these grouped objects here by targeting them in my layers panel, and it would go ahead and target that surfboard over here in my artboard. And one thing you might notice about this is the specific group that I have targeted right now happens to be this one. If I were to twirl open that group, you can see that there's also an additional group underneath that makes up this little blue swoosh, and also the drop shadow is an effect that's been grouped with this particular object as well. So I'm going to talk about the isolation mode here in a little bit as well. But what I first want to do is just think about the arrangement here and what I can do in terms of rearranging these to my liking. So say for instance you wanted to take this center surfboard and move that to the top of the stack. Well, I could simply take that path over here and drag it to the top of my layer stack, and there you go, the surfboard pops on top of the stack. Alternatively, I can do a right click, and when I right click I can go down to arrange, and I can bring this to the front, send it to the back, or just bring it forward or backward in a single step. The hotkeys for these are Command, right and left bracket, and if you want to send it to the front or the back, you hold down Shift. So this would be Shift, Command, right bracket, and left bracket. Those keys are right next to the P key on your keyboard. And so what I can do here now is just click out of that, hold down Shift, Command, left bracket, and that will push that surfboard back down to the bottom of my layer stack. So this is somewhat of a quick way of rearranging the shapes. And so what I'm going to do is just rearrange these so that the center one is on top and try to overlap these back into space. So I'm going to do this here on screen just by using my right click, so you can see this here now. Bring to front, and these here, I would need to send these back, so I'm going to go to Arrange, Send Backward, and then Arrange and Send Backward. And this can be a kind of slow to do it this way. So if I send this to the back, this should work out just fine, but I have to navigate through that sub-menu in order to do so. So now you can see the arrangement is just reversed in terms of the order here. But using my hotkeys, this can be somewhat faster, so I'm going to push that back. I'm going to push these back. I'm going to push these back. And so then what I'm doing here is I'm holding down Shift, selecting the other surfboard, and holding Shift Command left bracket to push those back as well. So now those are kind of rearranged in a different space. Another thing that I kind of want to talk about here is, say for instance, I wanted to rearrange those the opposite direction, having these outer ones on top, like this. What I want to do is talk about isolation mode. So just as before, we had briefly talked about the group that is making up these elements here. So these groups are making up the group itself. Isolation mode allows you to select any of these grouped shapes independently without the need to ungroup them first. So if I do a right click here, you can see that there is an option for ungroup. If I happen to ungroup these, you're going to see that that drop shadow has now disappeared because the drop shadow was applied to the group itself. And that drop shadow you actually apply through the appearance panel right here. You'd apply it as an effect under one of these. I'm trying to think of which one it is. I think it's stylized drop shadow. There you go. But it actually erases that drop shadow in this case, and then you'd have to reselect the element that you want to modify. I'm going to undo that command so I can go back, and I'm just going to once again bring this to the front. So arrange, bring to front, and we might as well arrange this to the front as well. Okay, so then I'm going to reselect this group, and we know that it's a group because it's telling us this over here in our layers panel, and we also have that drop shadow here again. But if I were to double click on any one of these elements within the group, what you're going to see here by double clicking, it ghosts out everything else in my artboard, and it also gives me this little tab up here at the top, basically telling me the level of the group element. And so then I can reselect the element inside the group independently and modify this to my liking. Now another thing to take into account here is that this type has been converted to outlines. So these are actually independent shapes that have been grouped again. So this is a subgroup within the grouping of the surfboard objects. So if I double click again, like this, and then reselect one time, like this, okay, you can see that I'm within a few layers of this group. I can select the object that I want. I can change the formatting of that group to my liking. Let's go with an orange here for that O for groundswell. And then what I can do is hit my escape key to back out of that, so I'm no longer in isolation mode. And so the benefit there is I actually don't have to ungroup the shape. It maintains every kind of effect that is applied to the group, and it still allows me to go in and select the element that I want to change or modify, right? So I can change the colors of a grouped element, perhaps on this side by double-clicking again, and then single-clicking. I should be able to modify these specific shapes that I want. So there you go. In my Arranging Shapes folder here, I pulled up the Gradients Reindeer document, and I just wanted to have a brief chat about a few things yet in this piece. So what I'm going to do here is just kind of run through my layers and talk about how these are stacked. I also want to briefly talk about gradients. Okay, so I'm going to talk about gradients. So I'm going to toggle on the visibility of that background layer, and I'm going to toggle off the visibility of my figure at the moment. And so really quickly, I'm going to select my regular selection tool. Down here you'll notice that the background layer that makes up this gradient background is locked. So I'm going to unlock that to make sure that I can select it. And this is just a rectangle that has been created and stretched across the full canvas of the artboard. And in dealing with gradients here, you can really assign those to any shape that you would like. So I might even just duplicate this here and then downscale it so that you can see this on a slightly different scale. Right? But this should illustrate that this is really just another shape. And if you look closely here, the gradient blend has been applied to the fill, and then there is a black stroke around the outside. But if I toggle off that black stroke, really now all you can see is the shape with the inner fill with the gradient applied. In dealing with gradients, there are really two ways that you can modify a gradient. Okay, you have the gradient tool over here on the left-hand side, so I can select the gradient tool. And what that will do is prompt me with this little scale over here. And this is where I can change the shape of that gradient, I can change the rotation of the gradient, I can change the intensity or the blending contrast of that gradient. Okay, so this happens to be a radial gradient at the moment, but I can also apply this as a linear gradient. The linear gradient applies this from one end to the other. Okay, and so there, when you're working with gradients like this, you really have two options available to you. You have the gradient tool, which allows you to manipulate the gradient in this form. Okay, I can even move the gradient around and perhaps reposition it, changing the scale of it, and so on, the midpoint, like so. Okay, and then I can also rotate it and change the shape of it here. Over in my gradient panel here, this gives me the various gradient options I have available. So here I can tweak the banding of the gradient. I can inverse the gradient here to reverse it. And I also have a gradient, this would be along a path. This is called a freeform gradient. This would allow me to add additional points with colors to those points. So it's a way of almost making a gradient mesh. It's actually a new way of making a gradient mesh, but I'm going to leave that alone for now. And I can also add additional colors to this. So if I click somewhere between the two colors I currently have characterizing this gradient, I can toggle a new node and then apply a new color. I can do this again. Double click and maybe apply a new color, and now I have a lot more flexibility in terms of how I want this gradient to appear, and then I can also tweak those things inside my shape as well, or maybe span this out like so, and if I hover my mouse just on the outside of that, I can rotate it. Right? So if I want this going on a bit of an angle, I can do that too. Okay, or I could switch that back to a radial gradient like this. Okay, there are also a few other radial gradients that I could select. Up here, if I go into my swatch libraries, there should be some gradient swatch libraries. Okay, so I could even apply a neutral swatch to this. So these are various gradients that are set up in libraries, and I selected that by going up here to the top to my fill, selecting my options, going into Open Swatch Library, and then I selected gradients. And then you can select any of these. Furthermore, I'm going to move out of my gradient chat here and move into how this object is constructed. Right, this particular character. So if I open this up, you can see I have a laundry list of paths and groups available. But when you really start thinking about it and breaking this down, these are pretty much just basic forms for the most part. A lot of these are ellipses, or this would be just a path that was rounded off with a bit of a weight applied, and then that was converted to a shape. These are mostly ellipses here, so that probably represents that line segment a little bit better with rounded edges. Then that was converted to a shape, and then these gradient blends here would have been applied to, actually these, yes, these do have a gradient blend inside, so that kind of sculpts the form. But you can see it's a fairly basic building blocks in terms of generating this particular graphic. And so in the future, as you guys build your logo designs, you'll be kind of getting into this a little bit more, where you're taking basic forms and building something out of it. So from an illustrative point of view, we have a number of effects applied to these shapes. So when I select this shape here and I look at my appearance panel here, I do have a few effects. In this case, it's just an inner glow effect, and that's giving me that really nice kind of gradient on the inner edge of that shape. On this shape here, we also have the inner glow effect. Actually, most of these would have the inner glow effect applied, and the particular settings for that effect would be very similar to one another. on every one of the shapes. These are probably just a little bit more intense on this one. The inner glow is that kind of effect around the outside of the antlers. And then when I undo this, just kind of go back in time, you can see how this is just assembled back up and positioned into space. And then everything is selected and grouped. And so then you could take the reindeer and drop him, oops, forgot his arm, little hand there. Select everything, group, and then I could shrink them down or modify them, duplicate them. So if I need a bunch of reindeer in space, perhaps these are further back in space so they can be smaller. And maybe these closer to the viewer or just a little bit larger. Huh. Okay, so now we have kind of an arrangement or an assortment of reindeer in linear space based on scale. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is walk into the Chapter 8 that you read for today. These three type relationships is what we call these. And largely this is going to relate to the content you're going to be reading in Chapter 9, the classifications of these various typefaces. But I want to go through these three specific relationships because they are fairly important whenever you are using more than one font or typeface within a design piece. And so a concordant relationship occurs when you're using one font family without much variety in style, size, weight, and so on. This keeps the page harmonious, and the arrangement tends to appear quiet and rather sedate or formal. It's sometimes downright dull is what it's saying here on this page. I would definitely agree with that. Let me see if I can I'm going to pull up a sample artboard here so we can continue talking about this. So a concordant relationship basically is such where you are using the same typeface. So if I took my type tool here and I just typed out concordant, and then I duplicated that by holding down my Option key and dragging it downward. So do that one more time. Just select the type, hold down Option, click and drag down like this. And I might actually push these closer to one another so that you can maybe see the difference a little bit easier. And just by default, Myriad Pro is the stock or default font that is used here in Illustrator. And you can see that the style is applied here. So this happens to only have a regular style available to us. But if we were to select maybe something like Helvetica, I'm sure all of you guys are familiar with Helvetica. So we'll use Helvetica, and then I'm just going to dump this one and then duplicate this one, holding down Option, clicking and dragging down. And here you can see that my Helvetica font family, this is our font family here, this is our style of the font family, okay? And the style now is something that we can change. Now, in order for this to be considered a concordant relationship, you're at least going to have to modify the style between the two typefaces that are working with one another. And it just so happens that the concordant relationship uses the exact same font family. So in order for this to be considered a concordant relationship, both of these various typeface styles need to come from the same family. Okay, so I'm leaving both of them selected as Helvetica. But this one here, instead of regular, let's change this to bold. And let's actually change this one to light. This would be known as a concordant type relationship, where you have applied two different styles of the exact same font family, which obviously would be in the exact same classification. So we'll continue talking about classifications next week, but this is known as a concordant type relationship. It allows you to offer somewhat of a visual contrast between the two style choices. And we could change this even a little bit differently to maybe a regular, or this one maybe bold oblique. Okay, so this would also be considered a concordant type relationship. What I'm going to do now is just duplicate this. I'm holding down Option, clicking and dragging. Let's do that one more time here. Okay. And I think the next one in the text is conflicting, so let's actually use a conflicting relationship here. And let me just select that type and duplicate that down. Okay. And so the text basically will go into explain that a conflicting type relationship occurs when you have two different typefaces that are very similar in visual presentation. They come from the same classification, but they are not the same font family. So they are basically not the same font. The style of the font is kind of irrelevant here. It more or less has to do with whether or not the font is in a different font family, and that the font families belong to the same classification. That would be considered a conflicting type relationship. And I think probably the best way to represent this is if I were to take something like Myriad. Let's use Myriad Pro. Okay. And this one is Helvetica. So let me zoom in a little bit so that you can see the difference here. This is known as a conflicting type relationship. Two styles that are pretty much the same. This is a regular style. This is a regular style. They are different font families. Okay. But based on the overall visual style or the visual presentation of these two typefaces, they belong to the same classification. And you're going to learn more about the classifications before next week. But I just want to mention here that there are similarities, right? I mean, these two typefaces have somewhat of a mono-weight presentation. They're absent of serifs. The X height is just a little bit different. The one on the bottom here, Helvetica, has a slightly taller X height, so you'll read about that for next week. And we also have what's known as a ligature here for the Myriad Pro. So the F and the L, you can see these are being connected. That is simply not the case for Helvetica. This extension down here underneath the G, this is known as a descender, right? So the descender is actually a little bit shorter to the baseline than what this one is. This one's a little bit more open. It doesn't quite wrap around back upwards quite as much as what this one does. And so the style is different, but it is very subtle in terms of the difference. Okay, let me close out of this real quick. And so if you were to write a sentence with one of these typefaces, like this, sentence. I think sentence is with an E, isn't it? Sentence. Let's just use this, right? So if sentence, say this was in Myriad Pro, you probably won't be able to notice this at first, but if you have a keen eye, you're going to recognize that sentence is not the same as these three words. This is A. So there's an obvious irregular presentation here between the two typefaces. So now what I'm going to do is take those two typefaces and take these down here, and I'm going to call these contrasting. Okay, so the contrasting relationships, let's talk about those. Contrasting relationship occurs when you combine separate typefaces and elements that are clearly distinct from one another. So these fonts would be coming from different classifications, okay? And the styles of those font families and the different classifications would also be somewhat different. They don't have to be, but the point here is that you're trying to contrast the two styles of type that are used together as much as possible so that you can actually see the contrast. So an example of this would be like taking Helvetica here and contrasting it with something that is perhaps like a, now these are all display faces that are somewhat Bodoni. Here Bodoni is a really good example. This is a modern typeface in terms of the classification, but this would be really good to go with something like old style. Okay, like an old style here. We have an EB Garamond with a few different weights. They're more styles than they are weights, so maybe I need to find something just a little bit better here. Baskerville. Okay, so if I select Baskerville and then select bold, this would be known as a contrasting relationship, where you obviously have a different visual presentation. The styles of these are different because one of them happens to be bold, the other one is light. But they're different font families because they're obviously different fonts. But because the styles are different in this presentation, it's obviously they're coming from different classifications. Okay, so that's the takeaway here for contrasting relationships, is that they come from different classifications. Most of them do work. Not all of them work as well. For in something like this, what I would do is use this font for like a heading or a subhead, and then I would use this typeface for body copy or writing a lot of type within some kind of entry or page layout presentation. Okay, so those are your type relationships. Those will continue to make more sense as you carry on into Chapter 9, which will be part of your assignment for next week. Okay, so moving into next week, there are definitely a few things that I'm going to want you to have a look at as part of your assignment. The first thing is getting back into these various links on the course Moodle page. So these specific ones on Aaron James Draplin working efficiently in Illustrator, talking about the side hustle, and also he takes on a logo design challenge here that's going to start getting you geared up for thinking about logos in terms of a brand, and how we can use those as a piece of identity for defining some kind of business or service. And as we continue talking about these techniques in Illustrator, this is going to start making a lot more sense to you when you start bringing together text and type and illustration work to define that identity. So screen these 4 videos for next week. I will forewarn you that he does use a lot of adult language, so it's somewhat colorful language. He's originally from Detroit. So just forewarning you there, I really don't care too much for myself, but some of you might be a little bit more sensitive to that. I would also like you to have a closer look at Chapter 9 in the Non-Designer's Design book. And so this carries on into the classifications, is what I have been calling them, or categories of type. It's pretty much the same thing here. We have 6 of them. Okay, so old style, modern, slab serif, sans serif, scripts, and decorative faces. And so we'll continue talking about these next week as well. Also, in preparation for next week, we're going to start talking about the throwaway shape method of illustrating in Illustrator here. So in the one folder Illustrator exercise files, there is a file titled fox.jpg. This is going to be a file that we bring into a blank document in Illustrator. We're going to set this up as a template image, and then we are going to start applying the throwaway shape method of building these forms. And we're going to talk about overlaying ellipses and various ways of cutting and bridging objects to define new shapes. And so something like this will be fairly easy to generate, and I'll do my best to kind of expose you to those specific techniques in the coming session next week. But there's really nothing that you have to do with regards to this image. Just kind of prepare yourself for thinking about how you might be able to generate this graphic with different colors, different shapes that happen to be stacked on top of one another in Illustrator. I promise you that if you were to try to create all of this with the pen tool, it would just not go very well. Your arcs here would not be consistent. You're going to have points that look a little wacky in some areas, even if you're trying to smooth those out as much as possible. Even for a professional, that would be fairly hard to do just with the pen tools. We're going to be looking at a few other tools in terms of applying them to techniques for generating the illustration work. And I think that is about it for now. Actually, there would be one more thing for you to start reading, and I'm going to try to bring this up as fast as I can. This would be on the Safari database. Now that I think about this, I definitely want you to do this for next week as well. So in the research databases here on the library website, I'm going to click the Safari database here. Let's see if this will open. I'm signing in using my Bluffton account. Hopefully it gives me access right away here. And it looks like I am going to have to search for the dummies. The M key on my keyboard is no longer working at the moment. I've had this issue with 3 keyboards, so it's obviously an operating system issue that I'm probably going to have to get with an update. So let's see if this will actually come up. Unfortunately, it's not going to. Dewey's. Let's see if I can snag an M. CS6, all for one dummies. Sweet. Let's see if this comes up. Okay. So CS6 design suite. And then what I want you to have a closer look at here is the Illustrator CS6 Chapter 6 using type in Illustrator. And so this will walk you through a number of things regarding the type tool in Photoshop, the difference between the baseline type tool and the area type tool here, wrapping text around objects or artwork. And then the area that I really want you to focus on here is, I'm not sure what page this would end up being in the book itself, but this information right here that you see, the assigning font styles. For your final, you're going to have to memorize this. The X height, baseline, kerning, tracking, font, and leading. These are terms that are defined right underneath, and you'll continue hearing me talk about this terminology in the future. This information is information you're definitely going to want to memorize by the end of the semester. And I think that's about it for next week. So review all of that content. We'll try to go through as much of that within a reasonable time frame next week. It takes me like 2 hours to render out a video that's about a half-hour long. So I have to render out the video and then post it to YouTube and then inform you that it's there. And I think this video this week will probably go a little bit longer than a half hour. So I'm going to try to keep these to a half hour about every week. And we will touch base next week covering those various elements of the assignment. Okay, good luck.